My wife had been refusing intimacy for months, and suddenly she wanted to have a baby. I already suspected she was pregnant, so I silently planned a revenge she never saw coming. When she announced a surprise pregnancy during dinner, I smiled and said, "Congratulations, darling." Then I put it on the table. Her face went pale. Andrew Carter was a man of routine. Every morning, he would wake up at 6 o'clock, brew a strong cup of black coffee, read the financial news for exactly 30 minutes, and then head to his accounting firm downtown. He found comfort in the precision of numbers, in balance sheets that always added up, and in predictability of his structured world. But lately, one part of his life had become increasingly unpredictable: his marriage. He and Rachel had been married for 6 years. They lived in a neat 2-story house in a quiet Denver neighborhood, surrounded by sycamore trees and well-trimmed lawns. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. They had successful careers, shared a mortgage, and hosted polite dinner parties for friends twice a month. But behind closed doors, something had shifted. It started with the small things. Rachel no longer kissed him goodbye in the morning, opting instead for a distracted wave. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter, was now always face down or clutched tightly in her hand. They used to talk late into the night, sharing thoughts, dreams, or even just laughing about the mundane. Now, silence filled those hours. Not angry silence, just empty. Andrew noticed her intimacy was the first to vanish. At first, he chalked it up to stress. Rachel had been taking on more responsibilities at her marketing agency, often coming home tired. He didn't want to pressure her, so he gave her space. But the space widened into a chasm. Weeks turned into months. He tried small gestures, leaving notes on her pillow, cooking her favorite meals, suggesting weekend getaways. But none of it seemed to reach her. She wasn't cold, exactly, just distant, as if she were always somewhere else in her mind. When he asked if something was wrong, she would smile faintly and say, "Just tired." That was the answer every time. Just tired. It was during one of those quiet evenings, both of them sitting on the couch, eyes fixed on the television but not really watching, that Andrew realized how far apart they'd grown. Rachel's body was curled at the far end of the couch, her arms wrapped around a throw pillow, her phone glowing dimly in her lap. He looked at her, at the woman he had chosen to build a life with, and felt like he was watching someone he barely knew. He thought about bringing it up again, asking her directly what was going on, but a part of him feared the answer. What if she confirmed the growing suspicion gnawing at his gut, that something or someone else had taken his place? He wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet, so he said nothing. The next morning, he woke up to an empty bed. Rachel had already left for work, leaving only a note on the counter. "Have a good day." No heart, no smiley face, just 4 plain words in her neat handwriting. Andrew stood in the kitchen, staring at the note as if it held a secret code. It didn't. At the office, he couldn't concentrate. Numbers blurred in front of his eyes, and he found himself rechecking basic equations, something he hadn't done since his first year as a junior associate. His co-workers noticed but didn't comment. Andrew was known for being steady, unshakable, but inside he was unraveling thread by thread. By the end of the week, he made a decision. If Rachel wasn't to talk to him, if she wasn't going to let him in, he would stop trying. He would pull back, observe, and wait. It wasn't passive aggression. It was self-preservation. He had given everything he could, and now he needed to protect what was left of himself. That night, they ate dinner in silence again. The only sound was the clink of cutlery and the soft hum of the dishwasher. Rachel complimented the chicken. Andrew nodded. Then they cleared the table together, like always. But something had changed. Andrew had stopped reaching for her. He was no longer the one trying to fix what was breaking. And in that silence, in that stillness, he started to see the truth more clearly than ever before. He wasn't imagining things. Something was wrong, and it wasn't going away. On a mild Thursday evening, as the Denver sky took on its familiar lavender hue and the first stars blinked above the suburban rooftops, Andrew returned home later than usual. He had stayed at the office under the pretense of catching up on work, but in truth, he had sat in his car for almost an hour in the parking lot, listening to music he barely registered and staring at the dashboard, lost in thought. Something had shifted inside him, and he wasn't sure he liked the direction it was pulling him. When he finally stepped through the door, he was greeted by an unexpected scent: garlic, rosemary, and something citrusy. Rachel was cooking, not reheating, not ordering takeout. Cooking. He blinked, momentarily disoriented by the warmth in the air, the clatter of pans, and the soft jazz coming from the kitchen speaker. It had been months since their home felt like this. She turned when she heard him, wearing a soft green sweater he hadn't seen in ages, her hair tied up loosely. "Hey," she said, offering a small but genuine smile. "You're home later than usual." "Yeah," he said, hanging up his coat carefully. "Busy day." He watched her for a moment. She looked calm, maybe even a little nervous. There was a faint flush on her cheeks, and her movements in the kitchen were deliberate, as if rehearsed. A bottle of wine stood open on the counter, non-alcoholic, he noticed, and 2 place settings were arranged at the table with unusual care. She glanced up again, this time holding his gaze. "I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight. Just the 2 of us." He nodded slowly, unsure whether to feel hopeful or suspicious. "Sounds good." They ate in near silence for the first few minutes. The food was good: lemon chicken, roasted vegetables, and a creamy risotto. She had even made dessert, judging by the small ramekins chilling in the fridge. Andrew found himself strangely detached, like he was observing the moment from above rather than living it. Halfway through the meal, Rachel set down her fork and looked at him more intently than she had in weeks. "I've been thinking about something," she said. He raised an eyebrow, meeting her eyes. "Okay." She hesitated, folding her napkin in her lap. "I know things have been distant between us lately. I know I've been hard to read, and maybe I pulled away more than I should have." Andrew didn't speak. He let her continue. She swallowed. "But I've realized something. Life is short, and despite everything, I still believe in us. I still believe in the life we built, and I want to take the next step." He furrowed his brow. "The next step?" She nodded, her hands clasped now. "I want to have a baby." For a moment, all sound seemed to fall away. The clinking of dishes, the background music, it all vanished under the weight of those words. He stared at her, trying to process what she had just said. "I think we're ready," she added. "I think I'm ready." Andrew leaned back in his chair, slightly. The first emotion that surfaced wasn't joy. It wasn't even confusion. It was a cold, creeping disbelief. "You want to have a baby," he repeated slowly. "Yes," she said, her voice steady now, almost rehearsed. "I know it sounds sudden, but I've been thinking about it for a while. I just didn't know how to bring it up." Andrew's mind reeled. It wasn't just the unexpected nature of the request. It was a complete mismatch between her actions over the past few months and the significance of what she was now proposing. No intimacy, no affection, and now a child? He stared at her, searching her face for a trace of irony, of sarcasm, of anything that might suggest this was a joke or a test. But she looked serious, hopeful even. "Rachel," he began carefully, "where's this coming from?" She gave a soft laugh, trying to lighten the moment. "I mean, we're not getting any younger. I'll be 35 next month. I've been thinking a lot about my priorities, about what really matters." "You've barely touched me in months," he said before he could stop himself. The words came out sharper than intended, and they landed with force. Her smile faltered. "I know," she said quietly. "I know that, and I don't have a perfect explanation. I've just been in a weird place. Emotionally, work's been exhausting, and I've felt off for a while. But I've been trying to figure things out. And now I think I'm starting to." Andrew didn't respond right away. He took a sip of water to buy himself time. He didn't want to lash out. He didn't want to accuse. But everything about this moment felt off, forced. He considered the idea that maybe she was trying to fix something by adding a child to it. Or worse, covering up something that had already happened. "What changed?" he asked finally. She looked away for a second. "I had a conversation with a friend last week. She told me about how she almost waited too long to start a family, and it made me think. I don't want to wait until everything's perfect, because it never will be. And I think this could bring us back together. There it was, the fix-it baby. The age-old myth that a child could mend the cracks of a broken foundation. Andrew nodded slowly, masking the turmoil behind his eyes. That's a big decision. I know, she said, leaning forward slightly, but it's one I want to make with you. He studied her for a long moment. The conviction in her voice was real, but something about the timing unsettled him. It didn't feel like a revelation. It felt like a cover. The rest of the dinner passed in subdued conversation. She spoke about potential baby names, about nursery colors, about her niece and how much she adored children. He responded with non-committal nods, letting her fill the space. Later that night, as she showered, Andrew sat on the edge of the bed staring at her phone. It was locked, as always. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to, because deep down he already knew. Something had already begun long before that dinner. Something that had nothing to do with building a future together. She wasn't asking for a baby. She was asking for a distraction. And now, Andrew realized it was time for him to stop pretending he didn't see what was right in front of him. In the days following Rachel's unexpected proposal, Andrew felt like he was moving through his own house as a guest. The woman who once moved around him with familiar ease had become a presence he couldn't predict. She was oddly cheerful, waking early, making breakfast, humming while she folded laundry. There was an artificial calm about her, as though she were acting a play, and Andrew couldn't help but notice how rehearsed it all seemed. What unsettled him most was how calculated her changes felt. Rachel didn't simply return to the person she had been before the emotional drought. Instead, she seemed to embody a new version of herself. Too polished, too deliberate, as a try to meet an unspoken standard. She asked him about his day. She laughed too loudly at his jokes. She touched his arm in passing. Small gestures she had abandoned long ago, now reappearing like clues in a poorly hidden trail. Andrew watched it all with quiet scrutiny. Her sudden attentiveness didn't match the months of distance. And still, she avoided any further physical intimacy. She mentioned children, brought up fertility apps, even asked if they should schedule a medical checkup just to be prepared. But each night, when they lay side by side, a silent gulf remained between them. Then came the morning Rachel skipped her usual cup of coffee. Andrew had been brewing the pot for both of them since they moved into the house. She liked it with cinnamon and just a splash of almond milk. But that morning, she walked into the kitchen, paused at the smell, and gently shook her head. "I think I'll pass today," she said, waving off the mug he offered. "I've been feeling a little off lately. Maybe I need to cut back on caffeine." That was the first red flag. Rachel never turned down coffee. Even on the worst mornings, it was part of her routine. The excuse was plausible. Sure, everyone rethinks their diet at times, but it stuck in Andrew's mind. He made a mental note and moved on. The second came a few days later when he found her in the bathroom, brushing her teeth with exaggerated slowness, then rinsing her mouth with mouthwash twice in a row. "You okay?" he asked casually from the hallway. Rachel turned, startled. "Yeah, just morning breath." He raised an eyebrow. "It's 3 in the afternoon." She laughed awkwardly. "I had garlic at lunch." Another note filed away. Soon more signs followed. She stopped drinking wine altogether. No explanation, just a quiet refusal each time he opened a bottle. She wore loose-fitting sweaters, even on warmer days. Her meals became strangely balanced, with meticulous attention to vegetables and hydration. She carried a water bottle everywhere. When she thought he wasn't looking, she rested her hand on her stomach, subtly like a reflex. Andrew said nothing, but the pieces were lining up faster than he could dismiss them. Late one evening, after Rachel had gone to bed, Andrew stood in the kitchen holding her discarded grocery receipt. He had picked it up by chance from the counter, intending to toss it, but paused when he saw the list. Salt-free crackers, ginger tea, prenatal vitamins. There it was. He stared at the small print, his fingers tightening around the slip of paper. It wasn't a guess anymore. It wasn't paranoia. Rachel wasn't planning for a pregnancy. She was already pregnant. And the more he thought about it, the clearer the timeline became. Her physical withdrawal hadn't changed until recently, and he hadn't been intimate with her in months. The conclusion came slowly, like ice cracking beneath his feet. The child wasn't his. He stood frozen in the kitchen for what felt like hours, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. There was no dramatic breakdown. Instead, a deep, cold calm settled over him. He wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. There were still too many unanswered questions. Instead, he began to pay closer attention. Where she went, who she texted when she left the room to take phone calls. One evening, Rachel mentioned needing to pick something up from her office. She left just after dinner, claiming it wouldn't take more than 30 minutes. Andrew nodded, gave her a kiss on the cheek, and watched from the window as she drove away. He waited 5 minutes, then followed in his own car. She didn't go to the office. Instead, she drove to a small pharmacy on the edge of town. He parked at a distance, watching her from behind a row of cars. She emerged 10 minutes later with a small paper bag, looked around nervously, and then got back into her car. He stayed out of sight. When she returned home later that night, Andrew was already on the couch, a book in hand. She smiled softly, placed a bag in her purse without a word, and joined him. "Everything okay at the office?" he asked lightly. "Yeah," she said, settling beside him. "Just needed to grab some documents." The next morning, while she was in the shower, Andrew checked her purse. Inside the bag was a second box of prenatal vitamins and a pamphlet about first trimester nutrition. He placed everything back exactly as he had found it. He began keeping notes, times, dates, patterns. Not out of obsession, but to maintain clarity. He knew how easy it would be to gaslight himself into doubt, to convince himself he was imagining everything. But he wasn't. Something was happening, and she was hiding it from him. He didn't know who the father was. He didn't know when or how it started. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Rachel was pregnant, and she had every intention of pretending it was his. Andrew had always been meticulous. It was what made him a reliable accountant, what gave his colleagues confidence in his work, and what reassured clients when he presented perfectly balanced reports. But that meticulousness now turned inward into his private life. As he began searching for answers Rachel clearly wasn't willing to give. He didn't storm through their house like an angry husband looking for evidence. He moved quietly, methodically, as if he were handling a delicate audit where one wrong move could erase the truth. The opportunity presented itself on a Saturday morning. Rachel had left early to meet a friend for brunch, something she rarely did anymore, and Andrew remained at home. He spent the first hour pacing the living room, torn between a voice that urged restraint and the gnawing instinct that insisted the answers were already close. Finally, he went to her office, a small room at the back of the house, cluttered with notebooks, half-filled coffee mugs, and folders from her marketing firm. He had been inside countless times before, usually to drop off mail or to bring her a snack while she worked late. But he had never gone through her things. That morning, however, he opened the bottom drawer of the desk, a place he had noticed she guarded with subtle caution. Inside were envelopes, neatly stacked, alongside receipts and a few old journals. At first, it looked ordinary, but then he noticed one envelope set apart from the rest, its flap loosely sealed. He slid it out carefully and opened it. Inside were medical documents. His eyes scanned the first page and his chest tightened. It was a blood test, dated 6 weeks earlier, with Rachel's name clearly printed at the top. Further down, the words jumped out like sharp blades. HCG levels elevated. Beneath that was a number that confirmed what Andrew already suspected. She had been pregnant long before their dinner conversation, long before her sudden proposal of starting a family together. Beneath the blood test was another sheet, this one more difficult to look at, an ultrasound, grainy black and white, the faint outline of something small forming. He held in his hands for a long time, staring at the blurry image. The date was circled in blue ink. Rachel had gone alone. She hadn't said a word. Andrew placed the papers back in the envelope, his mind spinning. He sat in her chair, elbows on the desk, breathing slowly. It wasn't just that she had lied. It was how carefully she had constructed the lie, how she had planned to present it to him as if it were new, as if they were beginning this journey together. The betrayal wasn't in the pregnancy itself. It was in the orchestration. He locked the discovery away in his memory and returned the envelope exactly where he had found it. Then, with deliberate calm, he left the office and sat in the living room, waiting for her to return. When Rachel walked in hours later, carrying a shopping bag and talking casually about her brunch, Andrew greeted her with a smile that had everything he now knew. That evening, he played the part of the husband she expected, listened to her chatter, nodded at the right moments, even helped prepare dinner. But behind the calm exterior, a plan began to take shape. He didn't know what the end game would be, not yet, but he understood one thing. Confrontation was pointless. If he revealed his discovery now, Rachel would twist it, explain away, insist he misunderstood. No, he would wait. He would let her think she was in control. The following days became an exercise in quiet surveillance. Andrew started noticing how carefully she managed her appearances. When she dressed for work, she chose clothes that obscured her figure, yet in front of the mirror, she sometimes lingered, adjusting the fabric around her waist. He noticed her growing sensitivity to smells, how she wrinkled her nose at strong perfumes or cooking spices. She masked it well, but the signs were there. One evening, she left her purse in the hallway, forgetting to take it upstairs. Andrew didn't go through it immediately. He waited until later when she was in bed. Inside, along with her usual wallet and makeup, was a folded piece of paper. It wasn't medical this time. It was a printed email confirmation for an appointment at a prenatal clinic. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. Again, no mention to him. That night, lying beside her in the dark, Andrew stared at the ceiling while Rachel breathed softly beside him. He thought about the man she might be protecting. Was it someone from her office? A friend she had reconnected with? The father of the child was a mystery, and yet, oddly, Andrew found himself less obsessed with that detail than with Rachel's performance. Every smile she gave him, every affectionate gesture, was now painted with a brush of deceit. And then, something strange happened. Rather than feeling crushed under the weight of betrayal, Andrew began to feel a quiet empowerment. He held knowledge Rachel believed she controlled. He knew the secret before she had revealed it, knew the truth behind her carefully crafted lies. For the first time in months, he felt he had the upper hand. The balance had shifted. On the night before her scheduled appointment, Andrew deliberately worked late, sending Rachel a message that he wouldn't be home until after she was asleep. Instead, he drove past clinics she would visit the next day, memorizing the location. He sat in his car for a long time, staring at the building. He didn't plan to stop her from going. He only wanted to see it with his own eyes, to picture where she would sit, where she would sign in, where she would continue the charade. When he returned home, Rachel was already in bed. She stirred when he slid under the covers, half asleep, and murmured, "Busy day?" He kissed her forehead softly, answering, "Very busy," before turning to face the wall. The next morning, Andrew left the house early under the guise of a client meeting. In reality, he drove back to the clinic and waited in a quiet spot near the entrance. At 9:30, Rachel's car appeared. She stepped out, wearing sunglasses and a scarf, almost as though she were trying to disguise herself. Andrew watched as she walked quickly inside, her purse slung tightly over her shoulder. He didn't follow. He didn't need to. Seeing her step into that building alone confirmed everything. Later, when she came home, she acted as though she had gone to work like any other day. She asked about his meeting, told him about an upcoming campaign at her office, kissed him lightly on the cheek. Andrew matched her energy, listening, smiling, nodding, while deep inside, the silence between them grew louder than ever. Now he knew for certain, Rachel wasn't just hiding something. She was building an entire narrative, one she would unveil at the perfect moment, expecting him to believe it completely. But Andrew would be ready. He wouldn't let her performance dictate the outcome. And as he watched her laugh at something trivial that evening, Andrew's decision solidified. He would play along, he would nod, he would smile, but he would be the one to choose when and how the truth came crashing down. The days leading up to the dinner were marked by an unusual atmosphere in the Carter household. Rachel had become almost radiant, her energy shifting into something lighter, as though she were carrying a private joy that no one else could yet see. Andrew noticed the care she took in her appearance, the way she brushed her hair more deliberately, applied subtle touches of makeup, and even wore soft colors that framed her face. She hummed when she moved around the kitchen, tidied spaces that had long been neglected, and seemed to be waiting for a moment of great unveiling. Andrew, for his part, remained composed. He went to work, returned home, and maintained a routine that had become their unspoken contract. Yet beneath that surface calm, every movement of his wife's only deepened the tension coiling inside him. He knew what was coming. The question was no longer if Rachel would tell him, but how she would do it. And, more importantly, how he would respond when she finally played her card. On the afternoon of the announcement, Andrew came home to find the house transformed. Candles were set along the dining table, casting soft pools of light against the walls. The air carried the aroma of roasted chicken with thyme and lemon, his favorite meal, something she hadn't cooked in months. A bottle of sparkling cider sat chilling in a bucket of ice, carefully placed beside 2 crystal glasses. Rachel stood in the kitchen, wearing a pale blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hands smoothing the fabric nervously as she set the last touches for the evening. "You're home," she said, her smile wide, almost too wide. Andrew set down his briefcase and removed his jacket slowly, studying the scene with quiet precision. "Looks like we're celebrating something," he remarked. "Maybe," she replied lightly, her eyes glimmer with an excitement she could barely contain. "You'll see." Dinner began with polite conversation. Rachel asked about his workday, about clients, about office gossip she normally found dull. Andrew answered with measured calm, never letting his voice betray the undercurrent of anticipation running through him. He noticed how often she glanced at him, how her fingers tapped restlessly against her wine glass, as though counting the seconds until she could release the words pressing against her lips. Finally, as they finished the main course, Rachel took a deep breath. She folded her hands together, steadying them on the table, and looked directly into his eyes. "Andrew," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "there's something I've been meaning to tell you. Something important." He set his fork down carefully and leaned back, meeting her gaze with serene patience. "I'm listening." Her smile wavered for an instant, then steadied. "I'm pregnant." The room seemed to pause. Her words hung in the air, suspended like fragile glass. She exhaled quickly, as though the act of saying it had been a release, and her eyes searched his face for a reaction. Andrew didn't flinch. He didn't widen his eyes, didn't ask questions, didn't even look surprised. Instead, he smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that seemed calm on the surface, though his thoughts churned with a storm he had already prepared for. "Congratulations, darling," he said softly. Rachel blinked, taken aback by the gentleness of his response. For a split second, her expression faltered, as though she had expected a different reaction. Relief soon replaced the uncertainty, and she laughed lightly, her hand reaching across the table for his. "I was so nervous about telling you," she admitted. "I didn't know how you'd react. But I'm glad you're happy." Andrew squeezed her hand once, then released it. He rose from his chair without explanation and walked toward the study. Rachel called after him, confusion in her tone. "Andrew, where are you going?" "Just a moment," he said, his voice calm, even pleasant. She sat there, bewildered, her heart still racing from the confession. She imagined he might be retrieving a bottle of champagne, or perhaps a small gift he had hidden away, something to mark the occasion. Instead, when he returned, he carried a plain white envelope. Rachel's eyes locked on it instantly. The color drained from her face. He walked back to the table with measured steps, sat down, and placed the envelope gently in front of her plate. He didn't push it toward her aggressively, didn't raise his voice, didn't accuse. The gesture was almost casual, as though he were sliding over a receipt for her to sign. Her lips parted. "What's this?" Andrew leaned back, folding his arms. "Why don't you open it?" With trembling hands, Rachel lifted the envelope. She already knew what was inside. She had hidden it herself. Still, she pulled out the folded papers and stared at them as though they were written in another language. The blood test, the ultrasound, the dates circled in blue ink. Her breathing grew shallow. Her eyes flicked up to meet his, but he said nothing, simply watching her with unnerving calm. I was going to tell you," she stammered. I wanted it to be special." I wanted to wait until the right time. The right time. His tone was still even, his voice neither harsh nor raised. Rachel, you've had weeks. And yet you chose tonight, after hiding it, after planning it like a performance. She shook her head quickly, her voice cracking. No, it wasn't like that. I was scared. I didn't know how you'd react. You've been so distant, and I thought this might bring us closer again. Andrew held her gaze, his expression unreadable. For the first time in years, Rachel couldn't predict what he was thinking. The man who once wore his emotions openly, whose frustration and joy she could read as easily as a book, now sat before her as a closed door. Her face paled further as silence stretched between them. She tried to reach for his hand again, but this time he didn't move. I love you, she whispered, almost desperately. I didn't mean to hurt you. I thought this would be good news. Andrew exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on her. The envelope still lay on the table, its contents now exposed under the glow of the candles. It wasn't just paper. It was evidence of betrayal, of secrecy, of choices she had made without him. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse her of infidelity, though the thought thundered between them unspoken. Instead, he let the silence do what words could not. Rachel sat frozen, her fingers clutched tightly around the ultrasound picture. Her lips trembled, but no more words came. Andrew finally leaned forward, his voice soft yet firm. Rachel, the time for pretending is over. The words cut through the air like glass breaking, not with volume but with precision. And as they echoed in her ears, Rachel realized the carefully constructed stage she had built for her announcement was collapsing beneath her. Andrew had not only seen to the performance, he had dismantled it in a single, quiet act. And in that moment, she knew her husband was no longer the man she'd control with secrets. He had become the one holding all the power. The silence after Andrew's words seemed endless, stretching across the room with suffocating weight. The candles still flickered on the table, their warm light contrasting with the cold tension that had settled between them. Rachel's fingers trembled as she clutched the ultrasound picture, her knuckles whitening. For years she had believed she understood Andrew, that she could predict his reactions, soften his anger, or redirect his suspicions with the right tone or gesture. But now, staring at him across the table, she felt the terrifying realization that she no longer knew the man she had married. Andrew's expression was calm, almost too calm, and that was what unsettled her most. His eyes didn't carry the fiery anger she had expected, nor the devastation of a man broken by betrayal. Instead, they were sharp, steady, and unyielding. She had prepared herself for confrontation, for tears or accusations, but she hadn't prepared herself for this silence that cut deeper than any outburst. Rachel tried to steady her breathing. Andrew, please. I wasn't trying to deceive you. I thought if I told you the right way, if I made it a moment we could share, it would soften the blow. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. He leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the table. His voice was low, deliberate. The blow isn't that you're pregnant, Rachel. It's that you decided I didn't deserve the truth until you could stage it. That's what cuts deeper than anything else. Her eyes watered, and she shook her head. I was afraid. I didn't know how to explain. Things have been so distant between us, and I thought this might... She stopped, the words collapsing under their own weight. Fix us? Andrew finished for her. He let the word linger in the air. A child isn't a bandage for a broken marriage. The truth of his words stung. Rachel lowered her gaze to the table, unable to meet his eyes. She had believed, in some part of her mind, that a baby might shift their dynamic, might bridge the gap she herself had created. But confronted with his unwavering calm, she realized how naive that plan had been. Andrew stood slowly, pushing back his chair. His movements were controlled, precise, almost clinical. He walked to the kitchen counter, poured himself a glass of water, and drank it in silence before returning. Rachel watched him, her pulse racing, waiting for the storm that never came. Rachel, he said finally, placing the empty glass on the table. Do you really believe this was the way to repair what we've lost? She swallowed hard. I thought maybe it would remind us of who we were, of what we wanted when we got married. Andrew's jaw tightened, the first visible crack in his composure. What we wanted when we got married was honesty, trust, not secrets hidden in drawers and announcements rehearsed like a performance. Her tears slipped down her cheeks now, though she tried to hide them, wiping quickly with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "I was just scared." The word hung between them, fragile and desperate, but Andrew didn't move to comfort her. Instead, he sat back down, his eyes fixed on her with quiet determination. "Fear doesn't excuse deception. If you had told me the truth from the beginning, maybe we could have faced it together. But now all I can see is how carefully you kept me in the dark." Rachel looked away, her chest tightening as if the walls were closing in. For the first time since their marriage began, she felt small in front of Andrew, not because of his anger, but because of the control he held in that moment. She had expected him to unravel, to rage, to accuse. Instead, he sat composed, every word measured, and that steadiness was more terrifying than any fury she had imagined. The minutes stretched on, the weight of the moment pressing heavier with each passing second. Finally, Rachel broke the silence again, her voice trembling. "So what happens now?" Andrew tilted his head slightly, as though considering her question with the same care he might give to a complicated equation. His answer came slowly but firmly. "Now, Rachel, we stop pretending. We stop playing games with each other. The truth is out, and there's no going back." Her heart raced. Are you saying you want to leave?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he rose once more, this time walking to the window, with a faint glow of the neighborhood streetlights filtered in. He stood there for a long moment, his back to her, his posture tense but still controlled. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, though no less steady. "I haven't decided yet, but I know this. Things can't continue as they were. You've taken something that should have been ours and turned it into a secret. That changes everything." Rachel buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. She had imagined many outcomes of this dinner. The joy of shared celebration, the cautious relief of acceptance, even the sharp sting of anger. But never this. Never the calm, deliberate unraveling of her plan in front of her, leaving her exposed and defenseless. When Andrew finally turned back to face her, his expression was unreadable. "We'll talk more tomorrow. Tonight, I think we've said enough." He extinguished the candles one by one, their smoke rising into the dim air like fading signals of what had just occurred. Then he walked past her without another word, heading upstairs. Rachel sat frozen at the table, the ultrasound still in her hand, staring at the extinguished candles as though they had stolen the last of her hope. Upstairs, Andrew closed the bedroom door quietly behind him. He didn't slam it, didn't lock it, didn't even sigh heavily. He simply lay down on his side of the bed, staring into the dark. For the first time in months, he felt a strange, heavy clarity. Rachel thought she had shocked him with her announcement, but it was she who had been blindsided. She had expected the husband she knew, the man who wore his emotions openly, who could be softened with apologies or distracted with promises. But that man was gone. What remained was someone she had never anticipated, a husband who now held the truth, who had chosen silence over fury, calculation over chaos. And Rachel, sitting alone downstairs with trembling hands and a hollow chest, realized the full weight of what she had awakened. The morning after the dinner felt strange, almost hollow. Andrew awoke before sunrise, lying still in bed while the faint light of dawn crept across the ceiling. Rachel was next to him, her breathing uneven, as though sleep had not come easily. He remained quiet, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence between them. The words from the night before echoed in his mind. Truths spoken, lies exposed, and emotions deliberately restrained. He rose without waking her, showered, and left the house earlier than usual, his briefcase in hand and his thoughts heavy. At the office, Andrew worked through numbers on autopilot. Spreadsheets and invoices scrolled across his screen, but his focus wavered constantly. He found himself replaying the previous evening, dissecting every word, every glance, every tremor in Rachel's voice. He had not demanded answers then, but the time for a real conversation had come. No more silence, no more guessing. They had avoided the real problems in their marriage for too long. each pretending that routine could replace intimacy, that politeness could substitute for truth. That evening, when he returned home, Rachel was already in the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped, her movements sluggish. The ultrasound photo was no longer on the dining table. It had disappeared, tucked away somewhere, as though hiding it could undo the night before. Neither spoke much during the meal. The clinking of silverware filled the air, a sound that only deepened the gulf between them. Finally, as Rachel set her fork down, she forced herself to break the silence. "Andrew," she said softly, not quite meeting his eyes, "we can't leave things the way they are. We need to talk." He nodded once. "Yes, we do." She hesitated, twisting her napkin between her fingers. "I know I should have told you sooner. I should have been honest from the start. But I was scared of losing you. I thought if I could find the right moment, maybe it wouldn't hurt so much." Andrew leaned back in his chair, studying her. His voice was calm but edged with something she couldn't ignore. "Rachel, what you don't understand is that keeping the truth from me didn't protect us. It destroyed something between us. The moment you chose silence over honesty, you decided for both of us. You left me out of my own life." Her eyes brimmed with tears. "I didn't know how to explain myself. I've been lost. For months, I don't even recognize who I am anymore. I've been afraid to admit it, even to you. Then why didn't you say that?" His question was sharp, not cruel, but heavy with disbelief. "Why didn't you sit with me and tell me you were struggling? I would have listened. I would have tried to understand. Instead, you shut me out completely." Rachel pressed her palms flat on the table, her voice breaking. "Because I was ashamed. Ashamed of not being the wife you deserved. Ashamed of how distant I felt. I thought if I told you, you'd see me differently, maybe even resent me." Andrew shook his head slowly. "Rachel, do you realize how much worse the lies made it? You thought you were protecting me from resentment, but what you created is far more dangerous. You created distrust." The room grew heavier with silence again, her quiet sobs filling the space. Andrew didn't move to comfort her. Not yet. He knew sympathy in this moment would feel like forgiveness, and forgiveness wasn't something he was ready to give. Later that night, they sat together in the living room. No television, no distractions, just the weight of unspoken truths still hanging between them. It was Rachel who finally dared to voice what had been buried for too long. "I've doubted myself for months," she admitted. "I wasn't sure if I want to be a mother, if I could handle it, if we could handle it. And I didn't want to tell you because I knew you want certainty and I didn't have it." Andrew turned his gaze toward her, his voice measured. "Rachel, marriage isn't about certainty. It's about sharing the doubts, too. I would have rather face your confusion than be handed a secret wrapped as a surprise." She nodded, tears streaming freely now. "You're right. I should have let you in. I thought I was protecting us from falling apart, but maybe I only pushed us closer to it." For the first time in weeks, Andrew felt the sharpness of his anger soften into something else. Not forgiveness, but recognition. She wasn't just a liar playing games with him. She was a woman drowning in her own fears, making terrible choices in the process. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, he could see the cracks of her vulnerability. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. "Rachel, I don't know what this means for us. I don't know if we can get back what we lost. But if we don't start being honest with each other, if we keep avoiding the truth, then we've already failed." She looked at him with desperation. "I don't want us to fail. I still love you, Andrew. I don't know how to prove that right now, but I do." Her words lingered in the air, raw and trembling. For the first time in months, they weren't avoiding the pain. They were naming it, confronting it. It wasn't resolution. It was only the beginning of the conversations they had buried under silence. The rest of the evening passed in quiet reflection. They didn't resolve anything, didn't suddenly repair the rift, but something unspoken shifted. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with the weight of truths finally spoken, even if imperfectly. When Andrew lay in bed that night, staring once again at the ceiling, he realized how far they were from clarity. But at least now, the silence wasn't avoidance. It was the echo of conversations they should have had long ago, conversations they would need to keep having if there was any hope of moving forward. The week that followed their first honest conversation in months was heavy with uncertainty. Andrew moved through his days with the unsettling awareness that every choice he made, whether to stay late at work, whether to eat dinner home, whether to share the smallest thought, was now loaded with unspoken meaning. Rachel, too, seemed to tread carefully, as though every step might cause another fracture in the fragile ground they were trying to walk across together. On Monday evening, Andrew found himself sitting in his car long after pulling into the driveway. The house looked warm and inviting from the outside, the soft light glowing through the living room curtains. But he couldn't shake the gnawing doubt in his stomach. For years, he had driven home to that same view with relief, grateful to step into the life he and Rachel had built together. Now, that same view felt foreign, like he was about to enter a stranger's house. When he finally walked in, Rachel was at the dining table with her laptop open, papers spread around her. She looked up and offered him a smile, but it was strained, too careful. "Long day?" she asked. "Yeah," Andrew replied, loosening his tie. "Just a lot of numbers to sort through." She closed her laptop gently, folding her hands on top of it. "Do you want to talk? About us?" Andrew hesitated before hanging his coat. He wanted to talk, yes, but he also feared what those conversations might uncover. "Not tonight," he said finally, his voice soft. "I'm too tired." Rachel's shoulders slumped just slightly, but she nodded. "Okay." That small exchange became a pattern. Each time she tried to approach the subject of their future, he deflected, not out of cruelty, but because he needed time to think, time away from her presence, time to sort through his own tangled emotions without being influenced by her tears or her carefully chosen words. He couldn't give her answers when he didn't even know them himself. On Wednesday, Andrew stayed late at the office again. His co-worker, Daniel, a man he had worked beside for nearly a decade, noticed his distracted state. "You've been off lately," Daniel said as they shared a quiet moment in the break room. "You're here late every night, and you're not really here, if you know what I mean." Andrew forced a small smile. "Just things at home. Complicated things." Daniel gave him a look of recognition. One man to another, the kind of look that didn't demand explanation. Don't let it eat you alive. Whatever it is, figure out what you can live with and what you can't. The word stayed with Andrew for the rest of the night. He realized that was exactly the question before him. What could he live with, and what was unforgivable? By Friday, Andrew decided he needed space away from the house, away from Rachel. That evening, he told her he would be spending the weekend at a friend's cabin in the mountains. She looked startled, hurt even, but she didn't argue. "If that's what you need," she said quietly, "then I'll be here when you're ready." The cabin belonged to his college friend Mark, who had offered it more than once as a place of retreat. Nestled among tall pines with no sound but the rush of wind through the branches, it became the sanctuary Andrew needed. He spent hours walking the trails, the crunch of leaves beneath his boots grounding him as he sorted through his thoughts. There in the solitude of the mountains, he confronted the question he'd been avoiding. Did he still want a life with Rachel? He thought of the years they had spent together. The late nights studying side by side in their 20s, the excitement of buying their first home, the laughter they once shared so easily. Those memories still carried weight, still mattered, but they felt like echoes from another lifetime, overshadowed by the months of cold distance and the crushing secrecy she had wrapped around him. He imagined what life would look like if he stayed. The baby, the long nights, the effort of rebuilding trust. Could he raise a child in a marriage that already felt fractured? Could he love a child born out of deceit, even if it was innocent of the circumstances? Then he imagined leaving. Divorce papers, selling the house, dividing everything they had built. Freedom, yes, but also loss. The end of a life he had once dreamed would last forever. For hours, he sat by the fireplace in the cabin, staring into flames as though they might offer an answer. But no clarity came, only the heavy weight of doubt, pressing harder the more he thought. On Sunday afternoon, he returned home. Rachel was waiting at the door, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. She hadn't asked where he had really gone or what he had done in his absence. Instead, She simply whispered, "I was worried." "I told you I needed time," he said evenly, brushing past her into the house. She followed him, her voice trembling. "Andrew, you gonna leave me?" He stopped in the hallway, his back to her. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he turned, his expression unreadable. "I don't know yet." The words hit her like a physical blow, and her knees seemed to weaken. She leaned against the wall, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. Andrew watched her for a moment, then walked into the living room, leaving her alone in the hallway with her fear. That night, they lay in the same bed, but the gulf between them felt wider than ever. Rachel reached out once, her fingers brushing his arm, but he didn't respond. Eventually, her hand fell back onto the mattress, and they both lay awake in silence, each trapped in their own thoughts. Andrew's doubts remained unresolved. He knew he couldn't make a decision in haste, but he also knew he couldn't linger in this limbo forever. The future stretched before him like a foggy road, uncertain and full of possible turns. And though Rachel lay beside him, the truth was undeniable. For the first time in their marriage, he felt utterly alone in deciding what came next. The uncertainty of his marriage weighed on Andrew like an anchor, and he soon realized that staying inside the suffocating atmosphere of the house was only deepening his confusion. The weekend in the cabin had shown him something vital. Space gave him clarity. For years, he had defined himself through routine, through the shared structure of life with Rachel. But that structure had cracked. If he was going to make any decision about his future, he first needed to find the version of himself that existed outside of the marriage. So he began to take deliberate steps to reclaim the parts of his identity he had let slip away. On a Tuesday evening, instead of driving straight home after work, Andrew stopped at a community center downtown where an old friend, Sam, ran a weekly basketball league. He hadn't played in years. His shoes and gear had been shoved to the back of the closet. But when he walked into the court, the echo of bouncing balls and sneakers squeaking across polish would stirred something familiar inside him. "Carter," Sam greeted with a grin, tossing him a ball. "Didn't think you'd ever show your face here again." Andrew chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "Thought I'd give it a try." The first game left him breathless, his muscles aching, but the rush of adrenaline cleared his mind in ways he hadn't expected. Running, passing, sweating. It felt simple, uncomplicated, free of lies or secrets. For 2 hours, he wasn't the husband questioning his marriage. He was just Andrew, the guy who loved numbers by day and could still shoot a decent three-pointer by night. The next morning, sore but lighter, he made another choice. He called a therapist whose card had been sitting in his desk drawer for months, given to him by a colleague who swore by the sessions. He scheduled an appointment for the following week. It wasn't something he had ever considered before. Therapy had always seemed like a last resort, something for other people. But now, he understood he needed a place where he could untangle the chaos without Rachel's presence clouding his thoughts. In the meantime, Andrew reconnected with his social circle, friends he had neglected over the years, as married life consumed his time. He met Daniel for a beer after work one evening, something they hadn't done in nearly 2 years. "You look different," Daniel remarked as they clinked glasses. "Not good or bad, just different. Like you're carrying something heavy." Andrew stared into the amber liquid in his glass. "It's the marriage. Things aren't what they used to be. And now with everything happening, I don't know what's left." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes we forget who we are outside of our relationships. Maybe this is your chance to remember." The word struck Andrew deeply. That was exactly what he was doing, trying to rediscover himself beyond the boundaries of being Rachel's husband. On Saturday morning, Andrew dusted off his old guitar. He hadn't played in years, the strings slightly rusted, the case smelling of neglect. He sat by the window and strummed softly, awkward at first, but soon the chords flowed back into his fingers. Music had been his outlet in college, a way to process emotions he couldn't put into words. Now, as he played quietly to himself, he felt that same release, as though every note peeled back layers of numbness he had built up over months of silence. Rachel noticed the changes, though he said little to her about them. She would watch him leave the house with his gym bag or return late from drinks with friends, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. One evening, When he came home, still humming a tune he had played on his guitar earlier, she finally asked, "Where have you been lately? You seem different." Andrew looked at her evenly. "I've been trying to find myself again." Her lips parted slightly, as though she wanted to protest, but no words came. She simply nodded, her gaze falling to the floor. When the day of his first therapy session arrived, Andrew felt nervous. He sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly together, before being called in by Dr. Elaine Morris, a calm woman with kind eyes who invited him to sit comfortably. The first session was awkward. Andrew stumbled over words, unsure how much to reveal, unsure even of what he felt. But gradually, with her gentle guidance, he began to speak more freely. "I don't know who I am right now," he confessed during that first meeting. "I've always been steady, dependable. I never questioned where I stood. But now, it feels like the ground has shifted under me. I don't know if my marriage is worth saving, or if I'm just holding on to a version of myself that no longer exists." Dr. Morris listened carefully, her voice calm when she finally responded. "It sounds like you've been defining yourself entirely through your marriage. Now you're being forced to look at who Andrew is outside of that role. That's not a loss, it's an opportunity." The idea stayed with him long after he left her office. Maybe this wasn't just about the betrayal or the lies. Maybe it was about the fact that it allowed his entire identity to shrink into being Rachel's husband. And when that bond cracked, he realized he had nothing else to stand on. Reclaiming himself wasn't just about survival. It was about rebuilding. Over the next few weeks, Andrew leaned into this rediscovery. He spent afternoons hiking alone in the foothills, letting the rhythm of his steps clear his thoughts. He cooked meals for himself, experimenting with recipes Rachel never cared for. He even began writing in a notebook, scribbling down thoughts, fears, and ideas about what he truly wanted from life. Rachel noticed a shift but didn't push. She seemed to understand, on some instinctive level, that his distance wasn't just about her anymore. It was about him finding the ground he had lost. One night, as they both sat in the living room, Rachel finally spoke softly. "You're changing." Andrew set down his notebook and looked at her. "I'm trying to. For too long, I let everything about me revolve around us. I can't do that anymore, Rachel. If we're going to have any future, I need to know who I am first." She nodded slowly, tears glimmering in her eyes. But she didn't argue. For once, she simply let the silence stretch, not as a wall, but as a fragile space where truth could breathe. And as Andrew sat back, he realized something surprising. For the first time in months, he didn't feel completely lost. He still didn't know what decision he would make about his marriage, but he was beginning to see himself again, piece by piece. And maybe, just maybe, that was the first step toward any future worth choosing. The shift in Andrew's life continued gradually, but once Rachel's pregnancy became more visible, everything around him began to orbit the reality of a child. The awkward silences between them didn't disappear completely, but there was a new weight pressing forward, a life growing that demanded attention, whether they were ready for it or not. For Andrew, this forced him to confront not just the state of his marriage, but also what kind of father he wanted to be. It started during one of Rachel's routine checkups. She asked him if he wanted to come along, her voice hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if he'd reject the idea. Andrew considered it for a long moment, then nodded. "Yes, I'll go." At the clinic, he sat beside her in the waiting room, the walls painted in pastel colors, decorated with smiling cartoon animals and photos of newborns pinned on bulletin boards. Couples around them whispered excitedly, holding hands, some even carrying baby books filled with notes. Andrew sat quietly, his hands clasped in his lap, but his eyes were sharp, absorbing every detail. When they were called in, Rachel lay on the examination table, while the technician prepared the ultrasound. Andrew stood near her, arms crossed, his face unreadable. But when the image flickered onto the screen, the faint outline of the tiny life forming, something unexpected stirred inside him. The technician pointed out the heartbeat, a rapid pulsing that filled the room. Rachel glanced at Andrew, searching for his reaction. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, almost reluctantly, he whispered, "That's our baby." The words caught him off guard. He hadn't planned to say them. They felt strange in his mouth, heavy and yet grounding at the same time. The sound of that heartbeat was undeniable, a rhythm that pierced through his doubts, if only for a moment. Afterward, on the drive home, Rachel finally broke the silence. "Thank you for coming today. It meant a lot to me." Andrew kept his eyes on the road. "It wasn't for you. It was for the baby." Rachel's hands tightened around her seatbelt, but she didn't argue. Over the following weeks, Andrew began to involve himself more in the pregnancy. He researched baby products online, made notes about pediatricians, and even signed them up for a birthing class. He didn't do these things for Rachel. He made that clear, but because he couldn't ignore the responsibility forming inside him. He had been raised by a father who never showed up, who left his mother to shoulder the burden alone. Andrew had sworn, even as a boy, that if he ever became a father, he would never repeat that cycle. And now, that vow pressed harder on him than ever before. The birthing class was awkward at first. They sat among other couples practicing breathing techniques and learning about swaddling newborns. Rachel tried to steal glances at him during the exercises, but Andrew focused entirely on the instructor. He asked questions about emergencies, about nutrition, about sleep cycles. His seriousness made some couples chuckle, but the instructor praised his attention to detail. One evening, after a class, Rachel spoke softly in the car. "You're going to be a good father." Andrew didn't respond immediately. He was staring out the windshield, his hands gripping the steering wheel. Finally, he said, "I have to be." There's no other option. That night, he lay awake long after Rachel had fallen asleep. His thoughts spun in circles, about the child, about his promise to himself, about the cracks in his marriage that no baby could mend. He knew one truth with painful clarity. He could be a father without necessarily being a husband, and that realization both frightened and steadied him. The first tangible step toward fatherhood came when they went shopping for baby clothes. Rachel pulled tiny onesies from racks, her eyes lighting up as she held them against her stomach. Andrew walked through the aisles silently, his hands brushing the fabrics, his mind replaying the sound of the ultrasound heartbeat. At one point, he picked up a small, soft blue blanket and held it for a long time. Rachel noticed, her voice breaking the silence. "Do you like it?" Andrew nodded. "Yes, it feels right." He placed it in the basket without another word. At home, he began preparing a space for the nursery. The spare room, once filled with storage boxes and unused furniture, was slowly cleared out. Andrew worked late into the night sometimes, assembling a crib, painting the walls a calm shade of cream, installing shelves. Rachel offered to help, but he often preferred to work alone, lost in his thoughts as he built the future piece by piece. It was during one of those nights, as he tightened the final screws on the crib, that he felt something he hadn't expected: peace. For a brief moment, all the tension between him and Rachel faded. The lies, the secrecy, the hurt. It was still there, yes, but it was muted by the reality of what was coming. He wasn't building for her. He wasn't even building for them. He was building for his child. The following week, Andrew returned to therapy, where Dr. Morris listened as he recounted the moments at the clinic, the classes, the nursery. "I feel torn," he admitted. "Part of me still can't forgive her. But when I think about the baby, forgiveness doesn't matter as much. What matters is being present, being better than my father was." Dr. Morris leaned forward slightly. "It sounds like fatherhood is giving you clarity that your marriage cannot. You're separating the two, and that's important. But you'll need to decide how much of your life with Rachel you want tied to this role. A child can connect you, yes, but it can also bind you to pain if you don't set boundaries." Andrew considered her words long after the session ended. He wasn't ready to decide yet, but he knew this much. The baby wasn't distraction, nor a mistake to be resented. The baby was innocent, and for that reason, he would give everything he had to fatherhood, even if his marriage remained uncertain. One evening, weeks later, Rachel found him sitting quietly in the nursery. He was in a rocking chair, the soft blue blanket folded across his lap, staring at the crib he had built. She leaned against the doorway, hesitant. "You really are preparing for this," she said gently. Andrew didn't look at her. His eyes remained fixed on the crib. I'm preparing for him or her. Because no matter what happens between us, that child deserves a father who shows up. Rachel's breath caught, tears welling in her eyes, but she said nothing. She understood the message buried in his words. And as Andrew sat in the dimly lit nursery, he realized that fatherhood, more than anything else, was shaping the man he was becoming. The doubts about his marriage remained sharp, unresolved. But when it came to the child, there were no doubts at all. He would be there, always. By the time Rachel entered her third trimester, the tone of their marriage had shifted. The sharp edges of confrontation had dulled, not because the wounds were healed, but because necessity forced them into a different rhythm. Arguments gave way to practical discussions. Silence gave way to planning. Their relationship was no longer about rekindling intimacy or pretending to be what they once were. It was about survival, cooperation, and preparing for the inevitable arrival of the baby. Andrew was the one who first framed it for himself. They were partners now, not spouses. Partners in responsibility, in logistics, in the shared duty of parenthood. That realization lifted some of the unbearable pressure from him. He no longer needed to force affection he didn't feel, nor did he need to pretend forgiveness had already arrived. What he owed was commitment to the child, and in that commitment, he found a new way to interact with Rachel. One evening, as Rachel sat at the kitchen table surrounded by baby catalogs, Andrew walked in with a binder he had started compiling. "I've been researching pediatricians," he said, placing the folder in front of her. "I made a short list based on recommendations and reviews. We should schedule a few consultations." Rachel blinked at the neat, color-coded tabs, her lips parting as though she wanted to say something more sentimental. Instead, she simply nodded. "This is good. Thank you." It wasn't warmth, not exactly, but it was functional. And that functionality began to define the weeks that followed. They attended appointments together, but their conversations in the car were focused on practicalities. Insurance coverage, baby-proofing the house, budgeting for daycare. At home, they took inventory of supplies, debated over stroller models, and assembled furniture side by side in silence. For Rachel, the distance was painful but also strangely reassuring. She had feared Andrew would abandon her entirely after the dinner, when everything had unraveled. Yet here he was, present, reliable, building alongside her. She longed for more, his affection, his forgiveness, his love. But she understood now that what he was offering was all he could give. For Andrew, the arrangement brought clarity. He no longer felt the need to interrogate her with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The truth of the past lingered like a shadow, but dwelling on it solved nothing. What mattered was the future they were constructing. Not as lovers, not as a happy couple, but as co-architects of a life for their child. Therapy helped him articulate this to himself. During one session, Dr. Morris asked, "How do you feel when you look at Rachel now?" Andrew paused, thoughtful. "I don't see her the way I used to. The affection isn't there, not like before, but I don't feel only anger anymore either. What I feel is responsibility. For her, yes, but mostly for the baby. It's like we become business partners in raising a child. And maybe that's enough for now." Dr. Morris leaned forward. Partnerships can evolve. What starts as business can shift into something else if both people are willing to grow. But it's also valid if that partnership remains purely functional. The important thing is that you're defining it clearly so you don't mistake practicality for intimacy. Her words settled in Andrew's mind. He didn't need to force the marriage into a shape it no longer fit, but he also didn't need to rush a final decision. The partnership itself had value, and perhaps with time, something more might emerge, or not. One Saturday afternoon, Rachel invited him to join her at a prenatal yoga class. The room was filled with expectant mothers and their partners, mats lined neatly across the floor. Andrew fell out of place at first, his tall frame awkward among the soft stretches and slow, breathing exercises. But as he helped Rachel balance during a posture designed to ease back pain, he noticed her expression soften into something genuine, grateful, vulnerable, human. After class, as they walked back to the car, she said quietly, "I know I've failed you in a lot of ways, but I appreciate that you're still here. I don't take it for granted." Andrew glanced at her, his expression neutral, but his voice steady. "I'm here for the baby, and for now, that's enough." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't argue. She knew pressing for more would only push him further away. At home, the nursery took on its final form. The crib stood ready, the walls painted in soft tones, shelves lined with neatly folded clothes and stuffed animals. Andrew spent hours ensuring everything was perfectly arranged, his accountant's precision translating into fatherly preparation. Rachel often stood in the doorway watching him, her hands resting on her belly, silent but deeply aware that she was witnessing a man who was already stepping into the role of father, even if he hadn't yet decided what role he would continue to play as her husband. Their evenings became quieter but more deliberate. They ate dinner together, not with romance but with routine. They shared updates about doctor's advice, budget adjustments, or tasks completed. There were no declarations of love, no gestures of intimacy, but there was stability, a rhythm built around cooperation. One night, as they reviewed hospital bag checklists, Rachel suddenly asked, "Do you think we'll ever get back what we had?" Andrew looked at her, his eyes steady. "I don't know, but right now we don't need to. What we need is to make sure this baby has the best start possible. The rest we'll figure out later." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was honest. And in that honesty, there was at least a sliver of trust, fragile as it was. The weeks passed, and Andrew began to notice that the absence of intimacy didn't sting as sharply anymore. He had stopped expecting it, stopped mourning it. In its place was something different, practical, respectful, grounded. It wasn't passion, but it wasn't nothing either. It was a foundation, and perhaps one day it could support something greater. For now, it was enough to keep them moving forward, side by side, toward a moment when their fragile partnership would be tested by the cries of a newborn. And as Andrew stood in the nursery late one evening, the soft blue blanket folded neatly over the crib, he allowed himself to wonder, not with bitterness, but with quiet curiosity, what kind of family they were about to become. The night Rachel went into labor was not dramatic, at least not in the way Andrew had imagined. There was no frantic rush in the middle of the night, no cinematic scramble for the hospital bag. Instead, it began with a quiet comment over dinner. Rachel set her fork down, pressed a hand against her belly, and said almost calmly, "I think it's starting." Andrew froze for a heartbeat, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. Then he set it down, wiped his hands, and stood. "Are you sure?" She nodded, her face tightening slightly with discomfort. "The contraction started an hour ago. I didn't want to say anything until I was certain." He studied her carefully, his pulse quickening. "How far apart are they?" 7 minutes, she said, exhaling slowly. Andrew nodded once, then moved with precision. He fetched the hospital bag they had packed days before, double-checked its contents, clothes, documents, toiletries, baby essentials, then brought it to the car. His movements were steady, his voice calm, but inside, his chest felt like a drum. This was it, the moment he had both anticipated and dreaded, the moment that would mark the beginning of a life he could not walk away from no matter what happened between him and Rachel. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Rachel leaned back against the seat, breathing carefully, her hands clenched on her lap. Andrew kept his eyes fixed on the road, glancing at her only occasionally. The silence wasn't hostile. It was focused, weighted with the enormity of what lay ahead. At the hospital, nurses moved quickly, ushering them into a delivery room. The fluorescent lights, the antiseptic smell, the steady beeping of monitors. All of it blurred into a strange haze around Andrew. He stayed by Rachel's side, gripping her hand, steadying her when waves of pain hit. Her fingers dug into his, and though she winced and gasped, there was a strange, unspoken reliance in the way she held on to him. Hours stretched long into the night. Nurses came and went, checking progress, adjusting monitors, offering encouragement. Andrew remained rooted beside Rachel, his presence quiet but unwavering. He wiped her forehead with a cool cloth, spoke calm words when her breathing faltered, and counted through contractions with her. It wasn't love that bound him to her hand in those hours. It was duty, yes, but also something deeper, something primal. They were two people tied irrevocably to the arrival of a new life. When the moment finally came, the delivery room transformed into a flurry of voices, and movement. The doctor gave instructions. Rachel pushed with all her strength, and Andrew stood beside her, feeling his own breath catch with each cry of effort she gave. And then, in a rush that seemed both endless and instantaneous, the sound filled the room. A baby's cry, raw, piercing alive. Andrew's heart lurched. He turned, and there it was, a tiny, wrinkled, squirming figure, held up briefly by the doctor before being placed on Rachel's chest. Rachel sobbed, clutching the child against her, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Andrew could barely breathe. He stepped closer, his eyes locked on the baby's face. So small, so fragile, and yet so powerful in a way it commanded every ounce of his attention. "You want to hold your child, Mr. Carter?" the nurse asked gently. For a moment, Andrew couldn't move. Then he extended his arms, and the nurse placed a bundle into them. The baby shifted slightly, its tiny fist curling against his chest. Andrew stared down, his throat tight. All the doubts, all the anger, all the confusion about his marriage faded into the background. In that moment, there was only this fragile life that depended on him entirely, this proof that despite everything, he had a purpose he could not ignore. "Hello," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm your dad." The words felt both foreign and absolute, as though speaking them sealed a vow he had carried since childhood. His hands trembled, but he held the baby close, protective, overwhelmed by a peace he hadn't felt in months. Rachel watched him through tears, her expression soft and raw. For the first time since everything had begun unraveling between them, she saw him not as a husband she had betrayed, not as the man who had withdrawn into silence, but as the father of her child. The hours that followed were a blur of medical checks, paperwork, and exhausted silence. Rachel slept intermittently, her body drained from labor, while Andrew sat in the hospital chair, cradling the baby against his chest. Nurses came and went, offering guidance and congratulations, but Andrew barely noticed. He was lost in the quiet rhythm of the newborn's breathing, the tiny warmth pressed against him. At dawn, as sunlight seeped through the hospital blinds, Andrew finally allowed himself to close his eyes for a moment. He was tired, yes, but beneath the exhaustion was a strange serenity. For weeks, he had been consumed by doubts about his marriage, torn between leaving and staying, between resentment and obligation. But now, holding his child, he understood something vital. His path forward might still be uncertain with Rachel, but his role as a father was not negotiable. Later that morning, when Rachel woke, she found him still holding the baby. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, his hair disheveled, but there was a calm determination in his face she hadn't seen before. "You look at peace," she whispered. Andrew glanced at her, then back at the child. "For the first time in a long time, I am—" Rachel's eyes welled with tears, but she said nothing. She knew he wasn't speaking about their marriage. He was speaking about the bond forming between him and the baby, a bond untainted by lies or betrayal. As the day went on, family and friends visited, bringing flowers and congratulations. Andrew accepted their words politely, but he remained focused, hovering near the crib, ensuring every blanket was tucked properly, every detail accounted for. When nurses offered to take the baby to the nursery for rest, Andrew refused. "I'll stay," he said firmly. That night, when the room was quiet again, Andrew sat by the window, the baby in his arms, Rachel sleeping nearby. He gazed out at the city lights, reflecting on the path that had brought him here. His marriage was still fractured, uncertain, a question without an answer. But fatherhood had given him something immovable. It wasn't about Rachel anymore. It wasn't about revenge, betrayal, or even forgiveness. It was about this child, innocent, fragile, deserving of the best version of him. For the first time in months, Andrew didn't feel lost. He didn't feel like he was waiting for answers. He felt anchored. And as he whispered softly to the sleeping newborn, promising silently that he would never fail them, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what came next with Rachel, his future had already begun. Months passed, and the rhythm of life in the Carter household transformed entirely. The cries of the newborn dictated their days and nights, filling the house with both exhaustion and unexpected moments of tenderness. Andrew adjusted quickly to the routine. Midnight feedings, diaper changes, pacing the hallway with the baby cradled against his chest while the faint glow of a lamp cast long shadows on the walls. He was tired in a way he had never been before, yet the fatigue didn't feel like a burden. It felt purposeful. Rachel, too, was reshaped by motherhood. Her body bore the marks of sleepless nights and physical recovery, but she embraced the baby with devotion Andrew had not seen in her for a long time. She soothed cries with a patience that surprised him, hummed lullabies softly under her breath, and seemed most herself when she was focused entirely on their child. Whatever doubts had clouded her before seemed muted now, channeled into the single role of being a mother. But between the two of them, the air remained carefully measured. They spoke daily, often at length, but almost always about the baby. Feeding schedules, doctor's appointments, development milestones. Their communication had improved in terms of functionality, yet it never strayed into the territory of intimacy. Their partnership was steady, respectful, but still hollow in places where love had once lived. Andrew didn't mind this as much as he once thought he would. The clarity of fatherhood had given him something stronger than the fragile foundation of his marriage. He no longer measured his worth through Rachel's affection or distance. His identity had shifted, anchored now in being a father, in showing up every single day for the child who depended on him. That sense of purpose gave him balance. Still, there were moments when the past resurfaced. One evening, after Rachel had gone to bed early, Andrew found himself sitting alone at the dining table. The memory of that night months ago, the candles, the carefully staged dinner, the envelope he had laid down, flooded back. He could see her face again, the way her smile had collapsed into shock when she realized he already knew. He leaned back in his chair, the house silent except for the baby monitor's soft hum. He remembered the cold satisfaction he had felt then, believing he had reclaimed power in a marriage built on secrecy. But now, as he sat there months later, the memory felt different. Not like triumph, not even like revenge. It felt like a threshold, one he had crossed into a new phase of life. Rachel joined him quietly a few minutes later, carrying a cup of tea. She sat across from him without speaking at first, both of them remembering the significance of that table without needing to say it aloud. Finally, she broke the silence. "I still think about that night," she admitted softly. "The way you looked at me. I don't think I've ever felt so exposed in my life." Andrew met her gaze, calm and steady. That was the night everything changed. For both of us. She nodded, staring into her tea. "I thought I was protecting myself by hiding the truth. But when you put that envelope on the table, I realized I had already lost something far more important than your approval. I had lost your trust." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. There was a steadiness in her now, a kind of acceptance that had grown alongside motherhood. "Do you think we'll ever get it back?" Andrew sat in silence for a long moment, weighing his words. Trust isn't something that returns on command. It's rebuilt, slowly if at all. But I don't look at you the same way I did that night anymore. I don't see you only as the person who lied. I see you as the mother of my child. And that matters more than the anger ever did. Rachel's eyes welled with tears, though she smiled faintly. "That's more than I deserve." "Maybe," Andrew said quietly. "But it's also what the baby deserves. A mother and father who can respect each other, even if we can't go back to what we were." In the months that followed, that respect became their foundation. They didn't force reconciliation, didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They showed up for the baby, for each other when necessary, and for the fragile partnership that had emerged from the ruins of their marriage. There were days when Andrew still wondered what it would mean to move on, to live apart, to redefine himself completely outside of Rachel. But each time he held his child in his arms, he understood that his future was no longer about absolutes. It wasn't about choosing between love and betrayal, between staying and leaving. It was about showing up day after day for the life they had brought into the world. One evening, as he rocked the baby to sleep, Andrew glanced toward the dining table where the envelope had once sat. The image of Rachel's pale face and trembling hands returned, but instead of bitterness, he felt a quiet sense of closure. That night hadn't been the climax of revenge or the peak of betrayal. It had been the beginning of something else, a moment that forced him to shed illusions and step into a harder, truer version of himself. As the baby's breathing steadied against his chest, Andrew whispered softly, "We'll be okay. No matter what, we'll be okay." And for the first time, he believed it.